Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Cotton Crossing by Lilith Saintcrow, narrated by Erin Deward. Cotton Crossing. Say hello. That bright late autumn day, Lee Quartine got in his big red and white Chevy with every intention of talking to her. He took a minute before he cranked the engine to stretch out his fingers against the steering wheel, to settle his lean ass in the seat just right, and to look at the freshly washed walls of his yellow manufactured. The pressure washer was a good deal, even if he'd had to outfit it with new nozzles and clean out the tubing, not to mention tune up the innards a bit. People were goddamn wasteful. But at least the pressure washer hadn't been dump dandruff, just a chunk of metal and hose sitting patient as a turtle on the side of Route 12 with a cardboard "free" sign attached, looking a bit lonely to tell the truth. Getting the last junked hulk out of the meadow was going to be a bitch, but he had the flatbed trailer and could probably ask Bobby Dorff to come by and lend a little muscle. If Coop's wreckers wouldn't take the old blue Ford shell to go with the other heaps Quartine Sr. had left his loving son, there was always the quarry. He might even have some fun out there after he dropped off the junked frame, take along a .22 and plink in one of the dry scars left by digging for this, that, and the other. Yes, sir, the old place was looking pretty good. The dead grass rectangles where the other rusting cars had crouched. "One day I'm gonna fix 'em up," Lee's granddaddy had mumbled on the porch once or twice, clasping his cup of joe or a jolt of rye, would fix themselves next spring. Nonna, if she happened to hear, would sniff, the sound that meant, "Then get your ass to it." Papa Quartine always pretended not to hear because picking a fight with Nonna was bound to get a man 6 things he didn't want and a half-dozen more he didn't like either. Through Lee's half-open window, the trees whispered. All the shameless ones were pretty much naked for the season, bare branches thrusting into deceptively rich golden sunshine. Indian summer sun, but the shadows held little sparkles of frost. The staid and starchy trees, the ones that kept their high collars and long sleeves even in summer, looked sideways smug at empty, shivering branches, at least until snow laid a coat over all, great and small. The ruts were going to be frozen stiff soon. Lee thought it was damn likely there would be some ice before the snows moved in. But not yet. Today, the sky was a deep, aching blue. Lee had the keys in the ignition and the paper Landys bag sitting on the passenger side of the bench seat. They weren't due until next week. He'd shined his boots even, combed his sandy hair carefully, and gave himself a once-over in the bathroom mirror. A sly devil with blue eyes had winked back at him. Right on time, his stomach tensed up. "It's just fine," he told his windshield. "All you gotta do is say, 'Hello, ma'am.' Just walk right on up and say it, natural-like." Just like he said hello to May at the drugstore, just like he said "Evenin', Percy" to Sheriff Blotzer every time their paths crossed. It wasn't any different than the girl at the bank when he took his paycheck in on Friday, not trusting that direct deposit bullshit. A check was paper. A check was real. Not as real as cash, totted up when the whistle blew, but times had moved on. At least he put his money in a bank, unlike Papa Q. That big old bastard had never trusted what he couldn't shoot. It was a wonder Nonna had married him, but she had, and he died thinking she shat rainbows and pissed sunshine, which was pretty goddamn near the truth. Certainly, she was the most patient woman put on earth. Her patience muscle got a workout each and every day, keeping Big Darrell Q on the straight and dry. Lee was stalling, and he knew it. He twisted the key and the engine caught, running along like clockwork, that beast. He'd checked the chains yesterday, too, in between the pressure washer and considering the meadow in front of the pretty yellow manufactured, clean and snug, and ready for winter. His arms ached a little, but the grim snarl of barbed wire in his stomach was worse. "Just gotta say hello," he told himself again, but it didn't sound so good this time. He popped the brake, dropped it into gear, cut the wheel, and got going. The drive was so familiar he could have done it blindfolded. Well, maybe. And if there was no drunken asshole on Slatter Curve. But today it was all so pretty, and anticipation boomed under his ribs, high on the left side of his chest. An iron chambray shirt, sleeves folded up just so, his daddy's prized leather vest worn so often it conformed to Lee as well as it ever had to the old man, his best jeans and well-shone boots. Even a dab of that vetiver stuff a blue-vested girl at the Walmart halfway between Lewiston and Cotton Crossing said was the best smelling for her money. If she thought he was strange for asking, well, he didn't have to go back for the pharmacy. He could get anything else he needed in the medical way at the drugstore in the corner. The VA was on the other side of Lewiston, too, if he took sick. Yeah, he was as ready as he could be, except that barbed wire in his stomach, rolling up like yarn caught on a kitten's paws. His mouth turning to a thin line and his hands tensing on the wheel, Lee drove on. Optimism. Ginny Mills overslept, which meant no time for a leisurely cup of tea. A hurried shower, a wriggle into the skirt she liked least, a quick wrap and pin of her dark braided hair around her head, and jamming her fingers in the car door when she half tripped on the cracked pavement of the duplex's driveway was what she got instead. It was distinctly unreligious of her to swear so viciously on a Sunday, and no doubt plenty of the people in the county she served would look askance, if they knew what askance meant, but thankfully none were in the vicinity to hear her. Her neighbors, the McCoys, were already at their small Baptist church halfway to Hatchie Ground, since Amy McCoy ran the Sunday school there. They had invited her a total of 8 times since she moved in, but she had an excuse for each and every one. "Where do you church?" was a constant question around here, and her standard answer was, "In Lewiston." It was the county seat, stuffed to the brim with both taverns and holy rolling places. If someone pressed for details, she could pretend to be distracted and escape. It was her day to work at the Cotton Crossing mini branch, by far her least favorite location. If it wasn't the teenagers making out in the stacks or damaging the books, it was the idiots who expected her to hand-hold through their internet surfing, or the dry box busybodies glowering in judgment of everyone else who had the misfortune to be in their vicinity. There were a few quiet old men who sat down with the newspapers, by far the most inoffensive patrons, and some of the housewives had reading tastes that were actually pretty respectable. There was one in particular, a pale-to-transparency woman so skinny her cheekbones were past model shapely and into frankly alarming, who was slowly but surely working her way through Dickens. That particular patron warmed Ginny's heart and broke it at the same time, seeing the shadows of black eyes and split lips on her with some frequency. A librarian, couldn't do a damn thing about that, except forgive any overdue fines that came that particular client's way. You could tell a lot about people by what they ordered in a small-town diner. Ginny's sample of the corner's oddities was limited to the literate, and it often occurred to her with a great deal of grim amusement that such a self-limiting data set was unusable for any serious academic. The good thing about Sundays was the 10-minute commute. She made it to the crossing branch at her usual time, her stomach growling from lack of breakfast, and her mood taking several turns for the worse when she saw the strip of parking lot, shared with the closed-down Elks Lodge and the laundromat on one side, and the tottering but not quite dead just-in-time antiques, which limped along by fleecing summer tourists, on the other, was, as usual on Sundays, full of broken glass. Nothing to do in the crossing but break bottles and tip cows. The glass meant street parking, and there was a line at Motton's Coffee, so there wasn't even the prospect of a substandard bagel. At least there was no snotty nose pressed against the branch's plate glass door. The papers were on time, and she raced through setting them out, getting everything turned on and muttering imprecations at the dank chill. The heat was old and cranky. It would be noon before it warmed up in here, and she'd only have a couple of hours of decent temperature before she closed up early. At least there were a few English breakfast tea bags left in the break room, and a forgotten box of stale granola bars in the very back of a cupboard. Sundays were half-days, and she was lucky to have a job at all. Library science majors were the forgotten of the academic tribes, like Moses, barred from the promised land. You didn't go into this field for the money, that was for damn sure, and she thought a season or two of small-town life would be romantic. The coffee maker spat out sour, mineral-smelling water, which would ruin the flavor of the tea. It didn't matter. Soon she'd have blessed caffeine, and she stood little chance of being mugged on her way to her car at night, even in Lewiston. Her co-workers were reasonable enough. The volunteers were, by and large, genuinely helpful, and after she closed the doors here at 2 o'clock, she could go home and spend the afternoon with some Chardonnay and Netflix. That's right, she told herself, making sure the Times was set just where old Elmore Cleary would look for it, on his favorite table in front of his favorite chair. Of course, it was the creaky one, and several times she had wished, vengefully, for it to splinter and dump him on his wide, sexist keister. Optimism. You'll hear from them soon. And that put a smile on her face, even while her tongue dug at bits of ancient granola stuck between the teeth her sainted parents had paid for a decade of braces on, in addition to college, so she could waste herself in a tiny town miles and miles away. Never mind that it was temporary, which her mother gamely mentioned almost every time Gin picked up the phone. Never mind that she was sneakingly grateful for the distance, especially when it came to things like the grandchildren question. Her sister was answering that one quite nicely. Optimism, Gin repeated, because last night she'd pressed send on 8 separate applications, and several years of hard work and self-denial were going to pay off. Seniority, even in a county system like this, counted as experience, and that was the only thing lacking from her resume. She'd be back in New York or Boston soon, handling fragile and precious texts in the land of decent takeout, high crime, and smog dyeing the snow gray instead of white on the pines cupping the crossing and frowning at Lewiston. She even had time to run another round of hot water, and that meant 2 cups of tea and a much-improved temper by the time blonde-bobbed Philly Lou, her Sunday helper and cheerleader for the Crossing Guards football team, burst in with a breathless excuse for being late and one eye constantly on her ubiquitous pink-jacketed smartphone, which reminded Jen she'd left her own goddamn phone at home. Some days you just couldn't win. "I don't understand." Madge Harmon blinked blearily at the glowing screen. "I thought you had the password." Ginny took a firmer hold on her temper than she had ever believed possible. The blue-haired biddy probably remembered the days of scrubbing with washboards, which had no doubt lingered in this benighted stretch of the country. "No, Mrs. Harmon, the password is your special code for when you want to sign in to your email." "Oh, Charlie took care of that." She adjusted the reading glasses on her snub nose. Once, Mrs. Harmon had probably been a fresh-faced, dairymaid-looking lass, and her round cheeks had probably been extremely attractive. Now, though, with her blue eyes sunken and her cheeks quivering a little, she looked like a perpetually startled Ewok. "And it just always opens up on my computer," he said, "and I'll never forget it. We'll use our most favorite word." "Great." Ginny moved the cursor to the password box. She had the strong suspicion she didn't want to know what that favorite word was. You just type it in there, and it'll let you look at your email. "Oh, good. I want the pictures my daughter sent me. She's in Canada, you know." "I know. You've told me 8 times. The urge to pinch the bridge of her nose was rising. "Okay, well, you can send her an email from here." Mrs. Harmon peered at the screen. "But what about the password?" "Just type it in." Ginny shifted her weight. Her back wasn't aching yet, but it was only a matter of time. "But—" A faint hint of color rose on Mrs. Harmon's cheeks. "I don't know how to spell— Oh, dear." "Spell what?" Thank God she'd stepped into her favorite shoes this morning. They were heels, yes, but they were reasonably comfortable, and as soon as she got home it would be yoga pants and the biggest, comfiest socks she could find. Hold that thought, she told herself grimly. Just another hour and a half. "But it's our password." Mrs. Harmon looked scandalized. "I can't tell you. Can't you use yours?" Ginny suppressed a small granola-scented burp. "You mean to get into your email? No, my password only works for mine." "Well, that's a damn fool way to do it. Librarians should have—" Mrs. Harmon began to mutter, and Ginny straightened as she heard a cough from the circulation desk. It was him again, one of the Sunday regulars, an extremely unlikely savior, but she'd take what she could get. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Harmon. I really wish I could help. Maybe you could check your email at home." "But I want the pictures now, to take to the bingo with me." The old lady sucked on the front of her dentures, a quick, habitual slurp. "I want Betty to see 'em." Ginny decided against telling Mrs. Harmon the public computers couldn't access the branch's office printer, and the pay-as-you-go copier was far too ancient to speak wireless either. Maybe the old lady thought the pictures would flutter out of the screen in a nice paper packet. "Try to remember how to spell your password. I'm sorry, there's someone at the desk." She patted the old lady's soft, talcum-scented padded shoulder before she walked away, though. Hip-checking the ancient swinging half-door that led behind the checkout was so habitual she barely noticed it. "Hi there." Her smile was wide and unfeigned, mostly because you had to have a sense of the absurd to work this kind of job. Philly Lou, all the way over in the children's section, cracked her bubble gum, and a shiver of irritation went up Ginny's spine. "You're back early. Worked your way through everything?" The man, she dubbed him military felon because his sandy, darkish hair was too short for the leather biker vest with the too faded to be deciphered patches on the back, but the tattoo peeping out from under his left sleeve looked faint and blue like jailhouse work, nodded. He was built rangy and had a pair of dark, piercing eyes. He carried a black baseball cap just as ancient as his vest. On Sundays, he came in, spent about 15 minutes in the quite considerable Western section on sagging pasteboard shelves standing under a John Wayne movie poster, and brought an armful of them to the checkout. He didn't seem to understand how the book drop worked, so Gin checked his former week's bounty in for him. Each time he brought them back in the same creased but still serviceable paper bag from the tiny crossing grocery store, Landy's, where you could buy a sticky container of cinnamon Red Hots that had probably been on the shelf since the first Bush administration. You could also get milk in glass bottles and bring them back for the deposit. Small-town living indeed. "What did you choose this time?" She began the process, turned the book over, run the barcode under the scanner, checked title and author to make sure. At least this county's library system had decent inventory infrastructure. One of her former classmates was working out in Wyoming in a tiny place where they still stamped paper cardstock with due dates. Progress had brushed the edge of this particular armpit of America. Zane Grey, good choice. And some of the series, they are really popular. Hotspur, one of the paperbacks screamed in lurid red font. A 70s version of a half-naked saloon floozy was hanging onto a guy who looked like he'd stepped off the old Bonanza show they used to have in reruns when Gin was a kid. Romances for men, really, although you couldn't call them that. Military felon didn't say a word, just looked at her. The set, steady expression on his face turned what might have been a kind of sullen attractiveness into something downright forbidding. Was he thinking she was judging his reading material? Of course, this guy never did say anything, just stood there while she checked his box, then touched the brim of whatever hat he was wearing and hurried away. Maybe he thought he'd get cooties from talking to an out-of-towner. She finished the stack. He took each one as she slid it across the counter and packed it into the bag. She glanced at his pile of returns. For a second, she thought of telling him he'd checked out the Lone Star Ranger this time, too. Then she decided to leave well enough alone. "Well, there you are. Due back in 3 weeks, but I'll probably see you before then. Have a lovely afternoon, Mr. Quartine." She took her best guess at pronouncing it as usual, and, as usual, got nothing in return, not even a correction. He just reached up as if to touch his hat brim, getting sandy hair instead because he'd taken off his cap like a good Boy Scout. Then he turned, sharp as a pin, the military half of her private name for him winning, and headed for the door at a long-legged, limber clip. Ginny clicked to the other screen and began checking the returns in. Philly Lou popped her gum again, and Ginny shook her head, her hands moving automatically, and her internal countdown to quitting time clicking forward step by step. "Number hasn't changed." "I'm an idiot," Lee muttered. "Pure D, grade A idiot." His tongue had just stuck itself to the roof of his mouth while he stood there like a dumb fuck, watching her beautiful wrists move, her dark green, almost black nail polish slightly chipped, her big dark eyes open and welcoming. No wedding ring, but that didn't mean much nowadays. The braid wrapped around her head wasn't quite loose, but a few stray strands of buckwheat honey hair were coming free, and it suited her. No earrings today, though. Usually she wore small, pretty gold hoops and a thread-thin gold bracelet or two. He would bet they were all real metal, too. She was class. And today, she'd even talked to him, said his name. Well, it would be right there on the computer screen, wouldn't it? And she'd pronounced it wrong. Today, she was in a knee-length herringbone skirt he hadn't seen before, and a black sweater, one with a scoop neck that showed her collarbones. Even those were pretty, for God's sake. He'd never noticed how many of the goddamn songs on the radio were wailing about some broken heart or another. Finally, he switched to AM, but that was full of windbags, pulpit pounders, and the weatherman talking about snow chances. Any fool with a nose could tell there wasn't any yet, though there was a bit of iron on the breeze if you sniffed deep. Lee spun the ancient radio dial some more, the craving for a cigarette rising under his skin. He hadn't smoked since he was 20, but damn if he didn't want to go back to it now. A shot or two of something hard wouldn't go amiss either. "Have a lovely afternoon, Mr. Quartine." She'd pronounced it a different way each time, like she was searching for the right one, and he couldn't even correct her. He finally found a news station, a soothing female voice, not as pretty as the library girls, but all right, purring along in that educated way. She talked that way, each word distinct, none of them rubbing against each other. Papa Q would have called that Yankee and mocked it. "Talk like they spittin' the words, boy. You don't ever trust that." According to the news, there was another war in the Middle East. Lee's shoulders hunched slightly, his chin dropping. That part of the world was a blood fountain, and every goddamn politician wanted to keep it that way. Another weather report. Nice, mild fall weather, the man said. Back to the female voice, while Lee waited for the turn onto the highway. Something about a big old protest in D.C., and last of all, a reminder to get your flu shot. "The Center for Disease Control recommends yearly shots for the elderly, the very young, and those with compromised immune systems. This year's flu season is expected to be the worst in recent history." Well, wasn't that just peachy? Something about it nagged at him, but he was too busy to chase it down because the little sedan in front of him had slammed on its brakes, which meant Lee had to as well, and thankfully he had new pads on the truck because it was a mite heavier than those fiberglass imports. A screech of peeling rubber behind him, and he hoped he wasn't about to get into a smash-up on a Sunday afternoon to top everything off. The holdup was a dead porcupine. The poor thing wasn't even bloating yet, not enough heat, and its gut was split open. You wouldn't even want it for meat, though it might do in a pinch. People remembered the lean times around here, at least the older ones did, and Papa Q had imparted a deep and abiding respect for the old uns in his little grandson. Lee exhaled hard, shaking away all sorts of uncomfortable thoughts. Sooner or later, he'd get up the nerve to say something to her. He just had to work himself to it the right way. He was coming up on Cherry Hill Road when it occurred to him that sometimes she went across to Mayburn's diner after she locked up the Cotton Crossing library. Not that he'd been sitting in his car watching, like some kind of prevert, as Papa would call it. He'd just happened to notice her crossing the street 2 weeks ago.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?